I'm Keith.
And I'm Emmeline, and you're listening to the Creative Education Podcast.
Joining us today is Sharon Hall, owner of Dyslexia Routes and trainer for Dyslexia Scotland. And, like Emmeline and myself, she also has dyslexia herself. So thank you so much, Sharon, for joining us. I wonder if you maybe want to introduce a little bit of your background and just tell the listener what it is that you do.
Yeah, sure. It's lovely to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me along. I am Sharon Hall, and I essentially work as a specialist dyslexia tutor, and certainly have been since lockdown started in March online. Essentially, I work as a tutor for Dyslexia Scotland and a trainer as well. In the past 3 years, I've started my own company, Dyslexia Routes. My intention is to support children with early intervention and to discover dyslexia and dyslexic tendencies as early as possible by screening children. And I also train teachers, as well as supporting as many parents and enriching parents with a knowledge of dyslexia as far and wide as I possibly can.
Fantastic. So I guess what the best place to start is to ask you how you got involved in that, how your interest in dyslexia grew in the first place.
I think I'm probably pretty similar to most parents in the fact that when my son William was 4, he's now 22, a very wonderful teacher sort of told me that she thought he might have dyslexia. And of course, I'd never heard of it at all, and my whole world went into a whir. And as I went along, as I discovered I couldn't really get the help I needed, it was therefore time for me to start educating myself on the subject. And that's exactly what I did. And is studying, going to university to find out many ways that I could support them, and along the way then therefore discovered of course that I'm dyslexic as well. And it made a lot of sense, having spent many years at school thinking, I wonder why I can't do this. And so at the age of 42, the ripe old age of 42, I discovered I'm also dyslexic, and I have a huge vested interest now in helping people discover as early as possible whether they are dyslexic or not dyslexic.
Fantastic. So what difference did finding out that you were dyslexic have? What did you suddenly know about yourself or what suddenly made sense, what lined up for you that hadn't lined up before?
Because I didn't find school particularly difficult, but what I found difficult was taking the exams at the end of the school year, because my memory is my long-term memory for facts and sequential learning, times tables, for example. I'm 52 and I don't know my times tables, and I'm not ashamed to share that with anybody.
No, me neither. I don't know them either. So
I think it's quite common amongst adults actually. I just found that it was the exams that I found more difficult, and it's the memory retention for me that I think I've supported subliminally along all of these years. Writing notes, by highlighting, by repetition, by learning till I'm blue in the face in order to pass an exam, and that just seemed right. I didn't actually find the coursework that difficult. So for me, it was definitely the memory retention. I'm not actually phonologically dyslexic, which means that my spelling and my reading and writing are fine, but I'm certainly dyslexic in memory, without a doubt.
That's really interesting.
I felt better. In answer to your question, I felt better. It made sense. All of those years, spent a long time not really understanding why I couldn't listen for very long, why I couldn't follow instructions, and I was in the Navy for 25 years. So following instructions in the Navy was particularly difficult for me.
That's loud instructions.
Exactly. Shouted at a lot.
Yes.
So remembering what people have just said to me is particularly tricky for me. So I've now got many strategies in place to support. So it all makes perfect sense. It's just brilliant.
Fantastic. We've spoken before about the fact that both Emmeline and I are also both dyslexic. So Emmeline, what age did you discover that you were dyslexic?
Well, I was in 4th year at secondary school, and I was sitting my prelims, my standard grade prelims. So what you were saying, Sharon, really resonated with me, because I was doing well. I was doing well in the coursework and everything was taking over. And then I failed almost all of the prelims, and we couldn't understand why. And I think that I had put in place the coping mechanisms and it had been okay, but it was just more information. And all of a sudden, that's when that I discovered it. But then once the proper support was in place for the exams, and you're saying about the times tables, I'm okay at times tables, but the alphabet I'm not okay at, and I'm not afraid to admit that. It's also, I was doing French, I think, but it was so helpful having somebody with the dictionary to find the letter, because otherwise I was singing that, I was doing A, B, C, D to try and work out, the next letter in the alphabet to find it. But that's when I found out, and then
I wasn't until uni. So I was even later than you were, and so I had done all my exams, much like you would have done, Sharon, before anyone said to me, "Oh, you realise you're dyslexic, right?" And I think realistically, the only reason anyone picked up that I was because I went to art school when I finished at school. So I headed off to art school, and I arrived there, and suddenly I went from a minority that had dyslexia to a massive majority that had dyslexia. And you can correct me on the figures, Sharon, because I'm sure they're out of date, but it was something like 2 in 10, and then by the time I got to art school it was 8 in 10. Most of us were dyslexic, including most of the tutor staff too. So it was suddenly glaringly obvious what I needed help with.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the issues can be, and again, Sharon, you can elaborate on this a little bit more, but for me the issues were that it didn't affect my reading. I was an absolutely avid reader as a young child. I would have read 2 or 3 books a week, like I would have eaten through them. And so the things the teacher had been trained to look for, if they were trained to look at all, were none of the things I was displaying. And so I could spell great long massive words as long as they were phonetic, and my vocabulary was very wide because I was well read, but I couldn't spell yacht or hospital. And so they just found it incredibly difficult to put me in the right place. And you'll be able to maybe speak a wee bit more about that, Sharon, about why that's so difficult.
It is. It's really, really difficult. I think that's why we spend so much time training people and talking about dyslexia, because it's so incredibly complex. It's complex because everybody's different, and I know people have heard this before. But we're not all literally unique, and we're all a thumbprint in the way we present with our dyslexia, with our weaknesses and our strengths as well. And that's why we find it really difficult to find it in a classroom. And it's more obvious in a way to the parents, because the parents have wonderful intuition that something's not quite right, and they will generally see the meltdowns after school, tiredness or fear of failure, for example. So it's generally the parents' intuition that will mostly kickstart looking for a child with dyslexia. Your young ladies, your girls, will tend to hide really, really well, because we really, really want to fit in as we're growing up, and we want to be the same as everybody else. So it's the girls that generally find their strategies much quicker than the boys. You're not just looking at the reading and the writing. You're absolutely right, Keith. It's not about that. It's about the memory. It's about the disorganisation. Organisation is a huge area that often gets very overlooked and needs supported into adulthood, really. Then say the memory, just organising yourself in the morning with your PE kit, getting out the classroom door, getting out the house in the morning. You're nodding away at me there, Keith. That's you, isn't it?
I'm nodding away because because I played music at school, I played drum kit, so I needed a stick bag, and I would frequently leave it at home. And I used to have a band after school every day, so you're just listing all the things that I would have done. I'd have been in the office phoning my mom at lunchtime going, I don't have my stick bag, like, how am I supposed to go here, how am I supposed to go there, and my mom was on first name terms with the woman in the office because she was dropping off stuff all the time. And another classic I used to do, and this I'm sure will ring a bell for you, Sharon, with other people, is that I never brought a coat home from a friend's house ever. The entirety of Aberdeenshire was covered in coats I had left places when I'd gone to visit people, because once I took it off, it was gone. And it's that quote that I remember somebody saying to me about dyslexia, where the idea of converting short-term to long-term memory, where you put the coat down, and an average person's brain would convert where you put it to a long-term memory, and the dyslexic brain goes, don't need that anymore. and deletes it. And so, I just had no idea I even had a quote and just walk out without it.
Exactly. And the thing is that we know that the dyslexic brain is completely rewired. It's wired differently, and it's scientifically proven now. And you have to think of the dyslexic brain as like a messy bedroom. And then you ask child to go and tidy the bedroom. Well, it's overwhelming, and it's exactly the same when you ask somebody to write a story. The ideas are there, but they're just not quite in the right order, and that's why we need to structure the support we give children. We give them explicit support, show them how to structure a story, even just putting on post-it notes and then putting it in order. And we need to do it little bit by little bit, tiny chunks all the time, and the progress that children make just down, because it removes the anxiety and the fear of not being able to do something. It takes away all that anxiety and all those crazy ideas. It's incredible to watch sometimes, but it's not obvious. We have to be kind to our teachers. It's not obvious dyslexic. It doesn't always present itself in the reading and the writing, certainly not for me, certainly not for you kids. So, but when you have that wonderful articulate conversation with a child and they're so full of knowledge of a particular subject, for example, and then you ask them to go and write their ideas down, that might be a way of finding out ideas, or perhaps they're not making the sequential progress you're looking for, but it isn't that obvious, and that's why it's so important to work with the parents. The intuition is just key to all of this.
Mm-hmm. So there's that, as you say, that misconception about reading and writing, and I think, and I'm speaking about old views now, of a lack of intelligence, and therefore anyone who's presenting as intelligent and knowledgeable and well spoken doesn't get picked up on necessarily because of this old bias that exists. So if you're not displaying problems in spelling, in numbers, in any of these things, because you've developed coping strategies the teacher can't see, then what should a teacher be looking out for? What is visible?
I think more than anything, it's going to be the memory, and it's going to be the lack of organisation. If it's not going to present itself in that kind of area, then you still need to think about that self-esteem all the time. How is the things that aren't quite working affecting the self-esteem? Sticks out quite well, and the social skills as well often come in. How are the friendships? Are they coping in the playground? Do they feel like they're different? Are they being treated differently? But it is really, really hard to see. You might think about sort of primary 3 onwards with the sequential learning, when perhaps they managed until that point where they're using their really strong visual strategies a lot of dyslexic people have. If they've used their really strong visual strategies, visualize the spelling of a word or the sequence of a maths activity or adding or something, then once it becomes more complex, there's more steps needed, the spelling becomes less phonetic, that's to show a lot more. And generally primary sort of 3 onwards is when it's, so yes, they might have coped in the early years of primary 1, primary 2, where it's and totally visualization strategies, that starts to become more complex, and that visualization strategy is just not enough anymore. It's not sufficient. So that's when you might start seeing the
So I guess the next thing to really talk about then is if you do think you're teaching in a room that has dyslexic learners in it, and let's be fair, most teachers probably are, because in terms of percentages, there's going to be a dyslexic learner in your class by probability. Then how can you change the way you teach, or change the way that your learners are accessing what you teach in a way that is inclusive for that dyslexic learner without singling them out to learn differently?
I mean, that's the whole answer to it. Your statistics are going to tell you'll have at least 2 or 3 children with dyslexia in your class. And so you would expect every year that you take on a new class that you will have a dyslexic learner. And in the words of Neil Mackay, who's a fantastic speaker, he tells you that if you teach the whole class as if they're dyslexic, then everybody wins. And we do know that you've got to differentiate. Of course you have. There's some children further ahead in maths, some children further ahead in literacy. There always will be. But actually, if you chunk that lesson, if you break it down into small pieces, if you check for comprehension and check for understanding, that's one of the biggest things. Because we're asked to process so much information in a short space of time and at speed a lot of the time, it's the processing that's generally the problem. It's not necessarily the understanding of the lesson itself. If you give too much information in one go, the brain needs to have a break. It needs to stop, it needs to rewind, think about what the teacher's just said, regurgitate that in. So take in that information and then regurgitate it. So if you give too much in one go, it's very, very difficult to process and to retain. So it's the working memory which is on overload all the time. It's trying really hard to keep up with the processing of information, and it's often just overloaded. So if you can break it down, that's the first thing. 5-minute chunks, stop, review what you've done, check for understanding. And a lot of children with dyslexia will not tell you if they don't understand, because it shows failing when they're actually not failing at all, but they don't want to be seen not to understand when everybody else around them is understanding. So the discretion is really important to check for the understanding. Maybe just a thumbs up, a secret signal with that child, again, so you're not singling them out. But overall, the strategies of change in a classroom are not enormous at all. It doesn't have to cost money. That slowing down, that checking for understanding, the repetition, the repeating of instructions, 1 or 2 at a time, but go to the whole table and check they're okay. Don't just go to that single person. And then repeat instructions, give visuals and multi-sensory resources with lessons. Far up the chain as you possibly can. We often get to sort of primary 6 and 7 and think, well, they don't need the blocks for maths anymore. Well, actually they do. Everybody does. Your representation of what they're doing. So if those resources hand for the children to go and get them when they need them, to give them that multi-sensory element to the lesson. And just to reiterate really that multi-sensory means exactly that. It's the elements at the same time. The visual, the auditory and the kinesthetic all need to be shown at the same time. Having just one doesn't give that impact on the long-term memory.
No.
So it doesn't cost money. Slow it down, chunk it down, check for understanding discreetly, and also give visuals and resources, multi-sensory resources wherever you possibly can.
Yes. It just, when you're speaking
and as
about
adults,
it,
we learn like that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. When you were just saying that, Sharon, I was thinking about times at secondary school when we did have those, things in place as well. And I remember in geography we were doing something about population, and we had jelly babies, and all of a sudden it made sense, the different populations as well. And it was probably the thought of getting to eat them as well. But there was but just thinking of the counting block, all of a sudden this made sense to me, because there was something there that I could see and really make sense of. Or in physics, having the whole class moving around like atoms, and things like that are really what yes.
You remember, because it's multi-sensory, and it's called an episodic memory as well. It made you feel good. The emotion was involved as well. You laughed, you thought it was funny, you thought you were going to get to eat the jelly babies. It has a huge impact when there's emotion involved as well. It really does.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I have a total blind spot when it comes to maths with numbers and physics. I was horrendous at physics at school. You're absolutely right. It's because it was just written down on a piece of paper, and I didn't have any other way of fathoming and understanding of it. And so I absolutely studied to get that grade. Like, I passed that maths course, but not because the teacher had given me the tools to. It was because I put in a whole bunch, like 2 or 3 times the amount of time that my classmates were doing. I just didn't realize at the time that they weren't doing that. And if someone had given it to me with, a bunch of jelly babies or something else that made it another way, explained it another way, then I for sure would have done better. And it's the mark of a good teacher if they can explain the same thing 5 different ways anyway. That should be part of your job anyway,
And the other thing is, you quite rightly said there, is that the repetition and the overlearning is just so important, and to absorb something that quickly is really quite difficult sometimes, not for everybody, but to absorb and retain and then move on to the next step often isn't enough. It needs to be repeated however many times for that brain function to work, so if you are going to move on to the next step in addition or times tables, whatever it is, repeat the first step again, and every time just repeat the first step, and eventually it will sink into the memory. It just takes such a finite amount of time longer, not always, but sometimes it does.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's really important to reiterate that. I think it's just if you think about learning anything as an adult now, if you think about when you learned to drive a car, how many times you had to that you do now completely without thinking about, but how many times you had to repeat that before that became something you did without thinking about it, and that's
Do you want to talk about how many times I had to repeat my driving test?
How many times did you repeat your driving test? 5. Wow.
I was 4.
Okay.
I was only 1. I passed the first time. But it was practical.
Just that reversing thing, it's totally overrated.
Who wants to go backwards? Sharon, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what goes into testing someone for dyslexia when they do go forward for that.
The process is written down wonderfully in a toolkit called the Addressing Dyslexia Toolkit, which has been created by Education Scotland just for teachers who are very, very busy people. And basically, as a teacher, where do you go next? There was never a pathway to follow, and so that's why this was created. And you literally look at the first page and it tells you exactly where to go next and what to do next. Testing is not actually encouraged in schools. You would consider perhaps labelling a child, and is it the right thing to do? I don't actually call it labelling, I call it opening doors to support, but some people do see it as labelling, and that's fine. So testing is not actually very widely used in schools. Every council, every county is obviously very different. But if you did want your child to be tested, the general route would have to be a private route. In schools, you can have psychology assessments. In Scotland, you can be tested by a psychologist or by a trained assessor, trained dyslexic assessor, and they have to be registered to be able to do that and trained to do that. And that would be a fully blown assessment, which would take 3 to 4 hours, a very large cognitive evaluation of strengths and weaknesses, sometimes very, very difficult to interpret if you're not a psychologist. It's always best to ask interpretation if you do go to those lengths. The thing about the reports is that they give you the whole list of strengths. Strengths are really, really important, and the strengths are what are going to give you the support for the weaknesses as well. Also, recommendations come in those reports, which are again very useful as well. An alternative to that would be a screening, and a screening does not give you a definitive identification of dyslexia. It will give you a sort of an identification of weaknesses and strengths, but not to the same extent. However, it is a good interim measure, and it's also starting a building platform to what that cognitive profile is, where the immediate weaknesses are that need support. So these can be done from age 5 upwards. They're done by somebody that's trained to do it, obviously, and can be done from age 5 to adulthood. But again, you need to find the right person. Support for learning teachers can do these assessments in school, but again, they're not completely widely used, not in my area, but they might be elsewhere in Scotland, and maybe people might want to contact you and let you know if they're doing them or not. But generally, testing is not encouraged overall.
That's really interesting.
Yeah,
it is, and I can't really I could sit on the fence and say everybody has a choice, which they absolutely do. In the experience of testing children, I know that it opens doors. And I know the biggest thing about the test, about a screening or an assessment, is that it gives you an answer. Because you often wonder in your life, why can't I? Why is it taking me 4 hours longer? Why did I get a C and I hours? And that's a quote from my own son. I studied all year and I got a C, and I was celebrating the week of a C, you know.
Well, and that was me with maths. I got out with my C and I'd studied really hard and I was just happy I passed. I was getting A's elsewhere, it was fine. I didn't need that A, I just needed passed.
Oh yes, I'm with you there. I'm totally with you there. You see, when children know why, when adults know why, when I found out why, it feels so empowered. Everything falls into place. I have to say that there are those who aren't happy to feel that they're different. But my reply to that was, God, it's just brilliant being unique. It's fabulous being unique. I love it, doing things a bit differently to people. So, go ahead and embrace it, but sometimes it takes confidence to do that. So testing is a personal choice of a child, and say, is it going to make an immediate difference? Will it affect them in a positive or a negative light? And only really the parents can answer that question, or the child themselves, if you ask them.
Yes.
I think for anyone that's struggling with someone who might find that outcome difficult, who might not like that answer, I would certainly say that for me, I equate my dyslexia, or in my case dysgraphia, which we can talk about in a little bit, but I equate my dyslexia with my creative brain. I truly believe that my brain is creative because I have had to get around a problem, or I've got around a problem and it's made my brain creative, whichever way you want to look at it. But either way, I do the job that I do now, and I'm successful at the things I'm successful at now because I have dyslexia, or because I'm creative about my dyslexia. Because I'm both, in terms of arts, I am both visual and audio. I play music and I have a visual arts degree. I went to learn to do that, and all those things are deeply affected by the fact that I had to be creative about my own learning. So that's to be celebrated. And if you have a child either that is your child, or that you teach, who is struggling with that, then it's to hold up that example of all these wonderful creative people who have embraced having dyslexia or anything else that makes them creative, and how that's changed life for them, I think.
Absolutely agree with you. And if I could give you another example of William, is a total train boffin, always has been from birth, and is still aspiring to be a train driver. He currently works for ScotRail, so he's absolutely living the dream. And his visual strength allows him to physically see the whole of Network Rail and the routes. And so if he can see it in his mind's eye, he can also see the underground, and so the underground map. So if you needed to get across London, he could just literally tell you which colour line to take. And that is the strength of his visual mind. And I am convinced that without that, he wouldn't be. He's incredible. He's an award-winning member of ScotRail. He wouldn't be in that position where he's not able to provide such incredible customer service, really.
Yes.
So and that's just me showing off there. That got my bit in, didn't it?
I think it's lovely as well, Sharon, that your new company, the Dyslexia Routes, and I'd read that the name was inspired by your son's enthusiasm for trains. I think that's brilliant. Yes.
I'm just about to open my new building, and I'm thinking I might just have a little train on it somewhere.
Yes, definitely.
Why not?
You need like a train underground map on the floor so people can find their way to your offices.
Oh, I didn't know. It's actually a shed.
So it doesn't matter.
Shed.
all the more trainy if it's a shed, surely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's right up the route.
You have to start somewhere, Keith, don't you?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I wonder if maybe we should talk a little bit about the differences then. So as I said before, I'm dysgraphic as opposed to dyslexic, which for me means that my reading's pretty strong and it doesn't really affect my reading generally unless I'm very, very tired and all the dyslexic errors come back then. But and again, that's to do probably with coping strategies. But I know that there are lots of different. There's dyslexia and dysgraphia and dyspraxia. So do you maybe want to talk a little bit about what the differences are?
Yeah, sure. I mean,
or not, this case maybe.
This is just really interesting, and that's when I meet lots of parents who are really confused as to what's going on, and one teacher thinks it's this, somebody else thinks it's that. I always say to them, why don't you just sit your child right in the middle of this lovely neurodiverse bubble, and because that's what we all are. We're all totally neurodiverse. It just means that we process the world differently, and that's really, really exciting. And the overlaps are so incredibly close that I don't actually know how scientists are working it out right now, because if I was to stick myself in the middle of the neurodiverse bubble, I'd be going off onto all kinds of branches, I'm sure. And I often say to parents, instead of looking for what you're looking for, why bother? Why just think, I do have issues with memory, my organisation's not great, but my reading and writing's okay, so that's fine. So just stick yourself right in the middle. And if you think about yourself with dysgraphia, Keith, again, a lot of children struggle to get their ideas down on paper. And you think, well, is that dysgraphia or is that dyslexia? And one young man said to me once, I've got my ideas here in my hand, and then there's like a traffic jam here. So they're just so clever, the way he described it. Children are very, very eloquent at describing what they find tricky. And so it was all kind of calm here. And so you would automatically assume, because holding the pen so tight, that's dysgraphia, and our fine motor skills aren't working properly and all this kind of stuff. Well, actually, he's probably really trying to force those ideas out of the pen, to get it onto paper. And I think all of these overlaps are just so close. And the dyspraxia as well, it's called DCD now, I think. The dyspraxia as well is very overlapping with dyslexia, having that awareness around you where you are in time and space, and your depth perception. Well, actually, depth perception is also something called Erlin syndrome. And Erlin syndrome is generally associated with words moving around on the page. But it's not just that. Which is dyslexic. I have Erlin syndrome, and words do not move around on the page for me. But I have Erlin syndrome because I can't remember what I've read. But is that dyslexia? So I can so understand why people get so confused, and that's why this neurodiversity is I think it's Judy Singer, I think she created it, forgive me if I've got the name wrong, but she coined this phrase about 10 years ago, and it's really, really interesting. And I really encourage parents just to maybe think, my child is neurodiverse.
I guess it's about knowing your own. It's about knowing your own stuff, isn't it? Like I know, for instance, that I can't write at speed. So if I'm gonna have to be somewhere where there's not going to be a copy of that thing, I'm going to record it, assuming that I have permission to do so. Because otherwise, I get instant cramp as soon as I start trying to write. All the muscles in my arm will tighten up, just like you were describing. There is absolutely a roadblock, a traffic jam in my arm as soon as I try to do that. And yet, I can draw photographically if I choose to. But it doesn't matter how hard I concentrate on making letter shapes pretty or correct or cursive, they're still scrappy. They're still 10 times worse than a doctor's handwriting. And I always find that really difficult when I was at school, that I could get an A in art and draw the thing exactly in front of me as it was, but I couldn't form the letter D without it looking like it was halfway between a P and an A. But that's just me, and now I know that that's just me, and that it doesn't matter if I slow down or if I speed up, the writing looks exactly the same. That's just how it is.
And it does make you wonder if that traffic jam is the fear of doing it, in a way, the fear of getting it the wrong way around, maybe, or, obviously there are fine motor skills there as well, but sometimes I think when you see children gripping a pen so tightly, and it's trying to force it onto the paper, scratch it through the paper, it's actually the tension of perhaps getting it wrong more than anything. Well, who knows? Don't forget autism as well, because sometimes this is another really important thing, that autism and dyslexia are often very co-located, and sometimes what happens is the autism sits very strongly on the top, because sometimes it's more outwardly shown than dyslexia is, and we perhaps forget that child may also be dyslexic, and it can almost act as a blanket to the dyslexia. Well, if you support that autistic child as if they were dyslexic, then again they win, just like everybody else.
Yes.
We need that multisensory element. We can't let some diagnosis kind of mask or blanket all the others as well. We need to be looking underneath. But the question is, do we need to have a name for it? Shall we just say, hey,
well, again, that's
yes.
Yeah.
It's about knowing yourself, isn't it? Again, when you're saying, when you're talking about one diagnosis over another, so if you label it and move on and never look at it again because you're not knowing yourself or knowing your kids or knowing the children in your class, then if you stop looking for something or stop listening to what's going on, then you're beginning to fail, aren't you? That's what's happening in there. I think the other one that's worth mentioning, and I really don't know a lot about this one, but I know of a couple of people who have it, is audio processing disorder, where they struggle to process the thing that they're being told, or they assign sort of the most unusual meaning to the words, and therefore give themselves more pressure than they needed.
Yeah. I have auditory processing disorder, and I have auditory processing in dyslexia. So you can have it either way. You can have auditory processing disorder by itself, or you can have it with dyslexia. And for me in particular, it means that I find it really difficult to listen. So obviously every now and again, my husband will say, "Are you listening?" And I'll say, "No." I can't, especially if I'm not interested. So it works to my advantage many occasions. On the flip side, it's actually really frustrating. So with us having this conversation right now, it's Zoom is a godsend to me, because I don't like telephone conversations. The fact that I can see you and I can see your facial expressions makes my life much easier, and your lips. So obviously the masks are not a great thing if you have auditory processing disorder as well. So for me to listen to your questions you're asking, I'm having to really, really concentrate and think. And I think on occasion I probably haven't even answered your questions. It means that I find interviews really difficult. I find interviews for jobs very difficult. I've always got a pen in my hand just in case I need to write down quickly what you just asked me. Yes, So, but it isn't just that. If you think of the classroom, we've already kind of spoken about, the teacher will generally give the lesson 15 to 20 minutes. It's quite a long time to process that information. So short breaks are really, really important. Almost like a buffering effect, and to buffer and start again. Some children need to... That's right, do little brain break activities or whatever that child needs, a little walk around the classroom or something. And but the other part of auditory processing with the phonological side is hearing the difference between sounds, and that therefore then affects your reading and your spelling in the long term. So if you had like the words, say, fear and fair, for me, I don't actually struggle with that part of it, but some children can't actually differentiate the sounds in words. They mispronounce words, which as a young child is quite funny that they mispronounce something. As they grow older, if you mispronounce words, you're going to misspell. So it's the tiny variations in our vocabulary, in our sounds, and they're so close. Some of them are so close. So auditory processing is huge, and again, that's when you're thinking about remembering things in a sequence. Processing things in a sequence. So if you're asked to do 3 things in the classroom, copy, margin, write the date, then you get one of those. Because actually the brain is struggling to retain it all. And that's the huge effect of auditory processing disorder. And then the biggie, of course, is totally distracted by anything that goes on around you. Doesn't matter what it is. If the grass is outside the classroom, you're straight to that window. If somebody drops something on the floor, that's far more interesting than what the teachers are saying. So it's a huge thing. And then, of course, we're thinking, is that child concentrating? Is he or she focusing? Is he or she not paying attention? Or maybe they just can't process what's being said. That's
It could be too much all at once.
Because
And I guess
much,
that's really interesting. That idea of, and maybe this can be confusing for a teacher, because we're saying present it in multi different ways, but don't give them too much at once. And what we're saying is we want these small bits of information, but we want you to give that information several different ways. But don't give the next bit of information yet. Like, do that bit, that first bit, with those multi-sensory versions of that, and then do the next bit. But don't do, they want more information, so I'm going to give them 3 bits of separate information, one after the other, all at once.
Asking for a lot, really, aren't we? We are asking. I think when you get into the routine of doing it that way, we do ask of our teachers, we really do. But we do need them now, very much.
Yes. Just when you said about looking out of the window, Sharon, once when I used to sit all of my exams in a room by myself, and I was once at university, and it was great. It was a big tall building, and I'd gone up and I was in the room by myself, and the examiner was behind me. But it was a glass building, and the window cleaner came down. I could not concentrate, and he was cleaning the window. And then he obviously realised that he was waving. He was going, good luck. And he obviously had gotten on to this is what I was doing. But in the attempt to take away all distractions, there was one.
What is absolutely brilliant is children who start a conversation. So you may be talking about one subject, and then something completely diverse will just come into that conversation. And I'm laughing because I do that all the time, and my son does it all the time. You're quite lucky I haven't done it tonight, actually. But it's just the fact that piece of information has into your head, and it has to be out there and then. It makes no difference whether it's relevant or not. It has to come out, otherwise it will never come out. So we just say be patient.
I think Keith and I can both relate to that when we've been filming our Create Way videos, and the number of outtakes
we do that
where we
to
must
each
both
other.
just be saying random things, just spinning them on.
There's at least 3 or 4 where we've started doing a take, and then a good 5 minutes later we're still talking, the camera's been running the whole time, and I just got up and said I'm actually going to start the take again, because I'm not editing all of this off the front of it, because we've just been talking longer than the actual shot's going to be. It's just silly. I wonder if we should finish by talking about each of us some of the coping strategies that we personally use. I think that might be really interesting, and I also think it might be quite interesting to discover if they're the same. So Emmeline, why don't you go first? What are some of the things that you do to help yourself?
Yeah, I think I'm over organised. I think I've gone into a state of list writing, and it's interesting what we're saying about mind maps. I think before we started talking, they don't work for me, but it's lists, bullet pointing. This is what I'm going to do. It's different now that I'm not studying, but also when I was studying, I had to have no distractions, like we were speaking about. If I really knew I had to focus on something, I couldn't have been sitting in the living room and reading it. I had to be at the desk, and this is what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to read this piece of information and take out the key points. And I think really it's the organisation and writing everything down. I've got to write down everything I'm going to do in a day, or I would forget that we had something on at 7 o'clock.
You do write a lot, yeah.
Yes, I write everything, yes, and I think that's my main coping. I also, timetables I find very hard. Bus timetables, train time, and so I'll, or we were speaking about the London Underground, I will have written out exactly what I need, because I find them almost impossible to read, a timetable. And also sometimes with menus, and I always read a menu before I go somewhere and know what I'm going to order, but I think that's probably also a combination of just the excitement of going somewhere for food. But yeah, I think it's being over organised. That's how I've managed. Mm-hmm.
Sharon?
Well, I could probably just completely repeat what Emmeline's just said, because I'm completely super organised. point where I would think I annoy myself. Sometimes my whole day is run by the clock. And I plan ahead. So if I know I've got to be somewhere by 1 o'clock, I work backwards. And I will do something for an hour, then I will stop. So everything's done in chunks. Yeah. Everything has a coloured folder or a basket. You can't see anything at the moment because I'm moving house next week, so everything's disappeared from this room. But everything's done in coloured folders. Everything's labelled. Everything's in date order and time order.
Yes.
This is awful, isn't it? I didn't know that.
I think it sounds great. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you do all of those things.
I do that, yes. It sounds wonderful to me.
Even though I work from home, I have an allocated day. So maybe I need to get out more. Maybe I just.
It's difficult to get out more at the moment, though.
It's true. Actually, as funny as all that is, what it actually does is it removes all anxiety, and that's a lesson learned over the years. And that's for children who are studying at the moment. If only they could learn that when they're younger, or we could teach them that when they're younger. Just if they plan as far ahead as possible and do it in stages and in steps, then it removes all that anxiety and that worry of doing it last minute. Which is
that working backwards thing you said is really interesting, I think, because I think that would be a really useful skill if you were working with a child who was struggling, is rather than work forward, find out where it's going to be and work backwards, and it will just make more sense for them as to why we're doing it this way. I think that's great.
Absolutely.
My coping strategies are similar. I write lists, screeds of lists all the time. I have them digitally on my phone. I have them written down. The other thing I like, though, is tech. And at uni, I remember them giving me tech to help me do stuff, and it just didn't really do it for me. And I suppose probably some of it was because I hadn't found it. It was given to me, and I went, no, I'm not doing that. Whereas, like tech that I use to run my business and things, all my accounts are online. All my timetables are online, and they can be accessed by my pupils at the other end, and everything's linked to everything else through all these back doors, and I like that works for me, because everything then is in my phone, so if I've forgotten something, I can access anything at any time, and it's there at my fingertips. The other thing that I do, though, that is funny, like what you guys do, is that my stuff has places, because if I don't put stuff back exactly where it goes, I will never see it again. There's the coat thing all over again.
Yes.
So I have a hook for my keys as soon as I come in the door, because otherwise I will spend half an hour looking for my keys. I have a basket that my wallet goes in that is on like the entranceway, because if I don't put that in the same place, it'll be gone. And then my phone essentially has to be attached to me at all times, because if I put it down, it's gone. It just, it will be a good hour until I find it. Because it's just it's not a thing. It turns invisible or something. I mean, I don't know what it grows legs and walks, because I can't find it. So that's my biggest strategy is that everything has its place, and it must remain in that place. And it's not even a conscious effort anymore. It's a taught, learned behavior. I come in the door, and it's a physical movement that I do as I come in the door now. Because I have had the high stress thing, where it's been 5 minutes till I need to leave the house and I can't find my keys, and I'm shouting at my partner, and we're destroying the house looking for the keys, and he's saying, why can't you find these keys? My keys are right there, where are your keys? And it's just it's years of me going, okay, I need to do something about this. We can't live like this anymore.
So you need to work backwards. That works really well, to work backwards. It's when you have to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to work backwards, that's the problem.
It's not enough hours a day, there really isn't.
It's far too long.
Fantastic. Well, it's been absolutely lovely to talk to you. I think it's been really eye-opening. Even for both of us who have dyslexia, I think it's been eye-opening, and I think it will be really interesting for anyone listening to gain a bit more knowledge about it, and not in a scary way, but just in a general understanding, and to see that it's no big deal,
Exactly.
especially if they've got dyslexia.
Yeah, it is. It's all about normalising. It's normal. Don't be afraid of something that you think you don't understand. It's quite. I mean, look at us. We're quite normal, aren't we? All of us.
Yes.
Quite
Yeah, I
normal.
mean, as normal as anyone else. I wouldn't want to be too normal.
Exactly.
Fantastic. Thanks
Thank you
so much,
so
Sharon.
much.
Thank you to Sharon for joining us, and thank you for listening. And if we've learnt anything, it's that we're all different, and that's to be celebrated. See you next time.